Hi folks, and welcome to BreakingWoke, how to identify, debunk, and dismantle politically correct ideas. I'm Douglas Kruger, author of the global new book, Political Correctness Does More Harm Than Good. Let me ask you a very simple, very personal question. Do you still have your faith? I am perhaps very fortunate to be able to say that over the course of my lifetime, this has not been an issue that I've struggled with. I have always believed in God and have had no difficulty in doing so. People on the far left like to argue that in order to believe in a deity, you have to have a low IQ, you have to be gullible, you have to have not been trained in formal logic, and so on and so forth. It makes for a good narrative, but it is simply untrue. The number of scientists today pointing out how science is indicating the presence of God is as astonishing as it is concealed by the mainstream media. In my own case, I have a degree in philosophy, I am a member of Mensa, and I believe very deeply in God. And from a layperson's perspective, I am profoundly interested in what is happening in science today. I don't pretend to be a scientist, but I'm interested in what we are seeing from both astrophysics and from DNA. And in either case, these fields of study are more and more revealing the handiwork of God. If this is all new to you and you would like to pursue these topics, I would recommend Stephen C. Meyer's Signature in the Cell. And we'll cover these topics at some point, and I'll go into some detail for you. The quick headline version of that is that we used to believe that to solve the problem of life, all you needed was the right mechanical parts. If you could get all the right molecules in all the right order, you could create life. We have since learned that this is absolutely untrue. You need another ingredient, and it's much trickier. And that ingredient is language. Encoding. The DNA encoding the language of life. There are instructions in a complex language encoded into DNA. And here is the great kicker. You don't get millions of iterations to make it work. This language had to precede the first living cell, or you wouldn't get a second living cell. So it is not the case that you get millions of iterations for this to develop. The language had to be there from the start, and it was. And that begs some very interesting questions. Who wrote the language? The argument from the stars is perhaps even more fascinating, a thing called the anthropic principle and fine-tuning. We'll go into great detail on that in a future video, but the simple idea is everything in our universe is so fine-tuned for life that it's almost as though someone knew we were coming. Scientists today try to get rid of the probability of God by positing multiple parallel universes. The basic idea is, they say, the odds are so unbeatable for this to have just happened by chance that what we will do is we will add multiple parallel universes in order to get infinite chance. We just happen to be living in the one where it actually happened. And of course you can't see parallel universes, you can't prove them, but unless they're there must be a God. Now folks, not my intention to go into the science or the philosophy of it today. A much simpler question. Do you still retain your basic faith? And here's why I think it's incredibly important. I like to read both very light and very heavy content. On a light day, you'll catch me reading Asterix or Dilbert, something that just makes me laugh, then I don't have to think too much. On the heavier days, and I think we have to have these for a full rounded education and for an understanding of where we come from and what matters to our species, you might catch me reading things like Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning and Mankind's Search for Meaning, and I strongly recommend that. It's a very short book. The very long book would be The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Now, these are extraordinarily heavy and very dark works. The first one is about going through the death camps at Auschwitz. The second one is about the gulags in communist Soviet Russia and how mundane evil becomes under a socialist system. Now, the entire point of my book on political correctness follows this line of reasoning. It starts off with the intellectual's crisis of faith. The crisis of faith leads intellectuals to ask, how do we orient ourselves in the universe in the so-called absence of a God? The best answers they were able to come up with were egalitarianism. If there's no distinctive or prescribed moral right or wrong, then the best we can do is collectivism, egalitarianism, equality. Equality leads to postmodernism. Postmodernism gives us modern-day political correctness. And so what I then do in the book is I trace the origins of political political correctness, then I look at the modern day incarnations, every single politically correct belief, socialism, transgenderism, all of the things that we are being taught from the perspective of postmodernism and a godless universe. And I debunk each one according to the science and the logic. Then at the end of the book, I set myself an interesting challenge. I ask, could you could you undo the entire politically correct project by reinstating God? And can you argue for him? Let me ask you the question, if you had to stand up and argue for God today, would you know where to begin? Do you believe enough in order to do so? And what I then do is I detail the arguments both from astrophysics and at a cellular level, and I go into the logical arguments for God, getting away from the science of it, saying here are simply the philosophical reasons why I believe in a deity. I then go one step further and I answer comedian Ricky Gervais, who quite rightly said, there have been 3,000 deities since the dawn of time, but don't worry, yours is correct. And I take that challenge and I say, all right, Ricky, fair enough. What criteria should a logical, almighty God reach? What criteria should such a God fulfill? And I show how the Judeo-Christian God fulfills every single one of them and how no other deity does so. And I'll give you just one small example of that one. You have to have the presence of such a deity unbroken from the dawn of human history. Now, Jewish people worshipping the Judeo-Christian deity were conspicuously present in ancient Sumeria, the very first civilization, pre-Egypt, and they have been, and we have been, worshipping this god in an unbroken stream right up to today. Now that doesn't necessarily prove a god, but its antithesis disproves competing gods. Take for example Thor. Where was the Viking god for the first few thousand years of human civilization? Not present and giving zero instruction to a supposed creation. And where has Thor been since then? And I give some 10 criteria by which one God is the logical, one true God. Now, none of that was actually my point when I started recording this video. Point was simply this. When I read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, I come across an interesting idea. He speaks about how people who deeply and truly believed in God had an easier time of the gulags than those who didn't. And he speaks about himself and about others who only nominally perhaps believed in something, or as was the custom within the Soviet Union at the time, had largely been taught atheism, that there was no God. And he uses this phrase, he said, "We entered the gulags spiritually disarmed." And I think that is so profound, and it's a thought echoed by Viktor Frankl when he speaks about the death camps, and he says, those who had a sense of meaning, those who held on to their faith, were able to go through this to a greater extent than those who had no sense of a profound meaning. That anchoring of meaning was life-saving and soul-saving. Problem is, you have to have built it up before you arrive at the camp. And I think that's quite a profound idea. In the Gulag Archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn talks about how those who arrived without faith not only were less healthy, less spiritually, mentally, psychologically able to endure, but were also more easily recruited to evil. When it became necessary to get one group of people to snitch on another, to beat another, to torture another, to kill another group of people, those who had no faith were there in the front of the line, and they didn't last as long. Now, of course, this is not to say that faith saved people from outright murder, but in an astonishing number of cases that Solzhenitsyn recounts, he talks about how those who were killed in their faith, those who went out believing in God, were at peace. And that's an astonishing idea. You need to read this book and to see how much that means. But folks, I think what really strikes home for me here is that during times of ease, during times before the camps, that's when you prepare your faith. That's when you strengthen it. That's when you learn what's going on in science that points to God. That's when you learn what is in the scripture that causes you to believe this is a loving, true God. Why do you believe? How is your faith today? Right now, things are relatively easy. Right now, we are living in relative peace. What happens when things change? Will you be spiritually disarmed by the time the hardship gets here? It is a profound thought, and for my small part and for the part of my family, we will believe and we will serve God. And I find that in no way contradictory to my studies in philosophy. In fact, everything that I have studied shows to me and indicates to me that postmodern leftism is rubbish. It is illogical. It is counter-truth. And that if you know the truth will set you free. Everything I see in the world of political correctness is a duplicitous attempt at replacing truth with something based on equality, egalitarianism. And that may sound good, but there's a little verse in my book that says, "There is a way that seems right to man, and the ends thereof are death." The Soviet Union was the attempt to take egalitarianism and make it the globally ruling ideal. The ends thereof were death. Now, there's a competing idea that says human beings are made in the image of God, that they are inviolable. And the Russian Revolution, which then led, of course, to communism and to one of the greatest death counts by any government in human history, there was a competing revolution a while prior to that. And that was the American Revolution. And that took this idea and it said, we hold this truth to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and made in the image of their creator with certain inalienable rights. And this idea is so profound. It says a government doesn't tell you your moral system. Egalitarianism doesn't tell you who you are. You are not, your rights or lack of rights are not dictated by a state. They come from God. And that is the idea that has led to the disbanding of slavery in the modern world, which was championed by Christians, conspicuously by Christians and no one else. And it is because of the belief system underpinning what they lived out loud. So the question is a very simple one, but a terrifically important one. Now, while you have the time, before any gates shut behind you, while you have the freedom to decide, how strong is your faith?